It's time to get off the sidelines and get into the fray. My name's Erik Mansur, and I'm the VP of Product Marketing for Crayon and your host for the Product Marketing Alliance's podcast dedicated to all things competitive intelligence, which is a discipline that's about accepting a hard truth. Your target customer has a litany of options that they could purchase to solve their problems, and only one of those options is yours. And here's another hard truth. Being the CI expert for your company is a job that can be made so much more difficult if you're unable to narrow your focus on a particular subset of competitors. So a phrase that's commonly thrown around in the tech space is analysis paralysis. And part of what can bring your CI program to the same type of, standstill is having to monitor and report on too many rival solutions. In this episode, we're going to talk about some techniques by which you'll be able to segment your competitors into different unique groups, setting your program up for success simply by compartmentalizing. And the expert I'm asking about that topic is Matt Tyrer. He's the head of Commvault's competitive intelligence program, a job that he's had for a little under 2 years. Now, in case you don't recognize the name, Commvault is a data protection and information management solution provider, which means they're in the security space, which means their list of competitors is like a mile long. So at some point, Matt had to draw boxes around those competitors, if only to give his team some ways to, focus on those that are more problematic than others. So I asked him, what was the first step he took when trying to draw those lines? What was his starting point for creating those competitor segments?
So we had knowledge already of who our top competitors were, just in terms of deal frequency, for example, market positioning. So there were a number of criteria that we had already established in terms of we know that these are our top 5. And so those were the easy ones to classify in terms of, most active, most present in the market.
And did you get that from your CRM? Is that how you found that information out? Or anecdotal? Like where'd that come from?
A little bit of everything. So some of it was coming from CRM, just looking at, who were known competitors that we're encountering. Some of it was anecdotal, in terms of inquiries from the field or just kind of chatter in the space. But also some of it is, a lot of it was also factual, looking at industry numbers, market analysis, stuff like that to kind of indicate, these are the major players in our space, of which we're one. Here's, who are considered thought leaders, here's who are considered, market leaders, because they might not necessarily be the same. And so, we boiled it down to, let's take the top 5.
Okay.
In terms of who we viewed as our top 5, and that's where we created that first low box, if you will, in terms of these are our top competitors that we encounter with a good deal of frequency that we need to be on top of what they're doing in the market.
So tiering, right? So it's not only who your sales team are coming up against most frequently, but also the general market awareness, whether it be, SEMrush / similar web scores or G2 ratings or whatever it happens to be. It's an amalgamation of those things that say these top 5 are the ones that we are competing against the most, or what the market believes are our biggest competitors. Does that make sense?
Yes, that definitely makes sense. And you kind of touched on, maybe I'm getting ahead of the discussion a little bit, but kind of some of the other boxes that we kind of created afterwards. So after establishing here's the top ones, we had to segment. Who else are we competing against? Because we don't just compete against those 5, and then also, who else in the market do we want to just keep an eye on? You sort of look at maybe industry peers or people that are in like an adjacent market, that are making significant moves in the market or that can affect the market. You'll look at, I'll throw a couple of examples out there. So we don't view them as competitors, but we certainly track them to see what are they doing in the market, such as like Microsoft, for example, Amazon, others like Salesforce, people that we don't view as, we're not directly competing for business with them, but they are big players in, the market overall, and kind of where they go or where they're looking are good indicators for, things that maybe we need to be mindful of, things that maybe our salespeople need to be mindful of, and, just it's good to know,
But
what they're doing.
brands that big could diversify at the drop of a hat. They could just basically buy one of your competitors or start making rumblings that they're going to do that. Or, they can hire a bunch of people in the Valley and spin up, something that is competitive with you. So you keep an eye on them, basically just by keeping them at arm's length, just to make sure that they're not suddenly veering out of their lane, right?
Well, I suppose, but also just, kind of for that broader view of things in terms of what are they doing,
Yep.
like when we're in the data protection, data management space, you look at those hyperscalers that provide, the world's biggest clouds. So, if the people running the world's biggest clouds are making changes to how you would interact with them, how you would, move data and workloads between them or to and from, those all affect, the discussions that we're going to be having with customers. If all of a sudden, uh, Microsoft says, hey, we've changed how, these databases work, or, we've created a new way with which you can onboard data into our cloud services, those are very relevant to, hey, when we're sitting down across the table saying, hey, we know that Microsoft has been doing this. Here's how we can support those initiatives, or here's how we, we play with that. So there's all sorts of different angles in that. So, there's tracking your competitors, and then there's, like I said, tracking others in the market that certainly have an interest in what, and we have an interest in them. But they can affect the discussions that we're having. They can affect what's going on in the market. So
to use two words, perhaps either aspirational, hey, maybe Commvault will compete with them in the future, and that would be great, or adjacent, where they're just they're running parallel to you, that you got to pay attention to them. They're perhaps are a provider in some way that you are working alongside in some way. They're simmering beneath the surface, but not somebody that's going to come up directly and in the competitor field within your Salesforce opportunity, right?
Right. I definitely put them more adjacent. I don't want to have to be competing with some of those vendors there. But to your point, all of the ones I listed are active technology partners, strategic alliance members, and stuff like that. And so it's important to know what they're doing with their business so that we can make sure that we're aligned, and that we can make sure that, as we continue to develop our product offerings, that they are, going to be complementary and supportive of all those other initiatives. So, like Microsoft is one of our longest standing partners. And so, of course, we want to know what they're doing. What are their initiatives, because those definitely going to play into any conversation we're having with customers that are also Microsoft customers. And the same will go with any of our other technology alliances. Yeah.
You got a tier 1, you got a tier 2, and those are pretty well defined. Like, the criteria by which they arrive in there. Do you have a tier 3? Do you have sort of a scratch pad of sort of the smaller, under the radar growth stage type of companies that aren't even, they're still miles behind you in the rearview mirror, but they're on their way up? Is that your tier 3, or is there another piece of criteria by which you create a third tier?
Right. So the way I've segmented it, and everyone's probably got a different way of categorizing things, but we've got the tier 1s, we've got the tier 2s, and then I've kind of gone into more like a use case or a line of business type of approach. Here are the ones that we would compete with in, for this particular use case. Maybe we'll say cybersecurity, ransomware detection. Okay, here are the players that are, focused there. And there, in some cases, we've got duplication. We've got our Commvault core product, but then we also have our Metallic SaaS offering. So, and the competitors are slightly different. There's some that overlap, and I do have some duplication in my categorization, because I may compete with them for this, I may compete with them over here. It doesn't mean that I've doubled up the information. It's just more from a grouping. Like they play in multiple spaces, so they can be a tier 1 competitor, but I also want to make sure that people that maybe are just looking up, okay, well, who do we compete with in this market, are going to see them in there too. So it's not an mutually exclusive categorization. You can live in several places at once. That makes sense.
No, that makes sense to me completely. And matter of fact, I think that's fascinating, because you guys compete in a normal, like a ton of different business lines, whether it be backup software, data governance, cloud storage, threat protection, like you just mentioned, and you can often compete with a completely different set of brands in one business line and compare to another, right? So what you're saying is you will often prioritize a major competitor, a tier one, based on those that you compete with on multiple fronts, because ultimately you're coming against them more frequently. And then perhaps a tier 1A, it's not necessarily outside of tier 1, but this is the biggest competitor in one of the spaces you guys compete with, and therefore it is important for you to maintain as close to a up-to-date competitive dossier as possible, because the sales reps that are having success in that business line are coming up against this one point solution as much as possible. Am I translating that correctly?
Yeah, no, that's a great summary of kind of how I've got that categorization working is exactly along those lines, because as you just laid out, if I'm competing for this particular use case or in this particular situation, that might be a completely different vendor from that top 5, or that might be a completely brand new vendor. We look at perfect example. Earlier this year, we acquired a cybersecurity company called TrapX, and of course, as part of that M&A activity, we had to look at, okay, well, who are their competitors,
Right.
and now there are competitors, for those use cases. So we created a new category just for that, and put their competitors in there so that we could keep track of this new area that we're moving into in terms of some of the more proactive cybersecurity elements. So
that's interesting. So for a growing company like yours, every time you guys acquire a point solution to add to your portfolio, not only you actually take on those list of competitors, and sometimes those competitors that you're bringing on, you're already competing with, because you're also competing against portfolio type companies.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, they are brand new and unique, and you got to basically start from scratch and start building up a competitive knowledge base around those, the new competitors that you have now as a result of those new point solutions.
Exactly. And you could look at it from another way too. Is it doesn't have to be an M&A type activity. It could be just maybe to your point, portfolio diversification. It's like, hey,
Sure.
you know what? We launched a new line of business.
Exactly.
So it's like, who do we another perfect example. We just announced today, support for Oracle Cloud, but from our Metallic SaaS offering. So now we got to look at, okay, are there any players that we didn't consider before that
Sure.
That have now stepped into the chat, if you will. So in this case, it was additive. Like we've added new features. So are there new people that we might compete with? But it could be something completely brand new. It's like, hey, we just launched this brand new product or this new offering. Obviously we'd be tracking them before the launch, but yeah, it's any of those type of trigger activities that could all of a sudden change either how you're categorizing things or add new people into the mix. And of course, as you're kind of taking that broad market view of things, you notice, who are some of, maybe like you said, the up and comers that we're not running into, but we want to keep an eye on and see, okay, well, what are they doing? Are they doing anything that interesting? And just to kind of keep your finger on the pulse, if you will, in terms of not just who are the big players, but who are going to be maybe those next disruptors that are going to come in and try and make some noise.
I want to go back 30 seconds, and you had mentioned that obviously the way you guys have done segmentation up until this point is based on tiering, so sort of a prioritization methodology. And my thought was, okay, so how frequently do you reprioritize? Is it once a quarter? Is it once a year? But it seems like it's not so much time-based as it is moment-based. Like, hey,
right,
we acquired this company, now it's time to reprioritize things, for example. Or we built a new product, now it's time to reprioritize. It's not like it's a regular exercise. It can happen frequently or infrequently depending on what the market is doing and really what Commvault is doing, right? It's not something you wind your watch by. It is something like, well, we know we're going to have to reprioritize at some point as a result of this change, right?
Right. And there's kind of two halves. There's kind of the ongoing. I always look at all of our competitive assets as living entities. They're not static, because you just don't know what news is going to break tomorrow. So we always have to be able to react to those types of market trigger events where, hey, competitor A just released product B, or something along those lines. So, when those types of trigger events take place, then we go through and see like, okay, well, what of our things that we have do we need to change? Do we need to adjust? Do we need to your point, do we need to maybe shuffle the deck a little bit and move some people around? Um, and that would be on, on top of just the regular reviews that we go through anyway, just to make sure, hey, is all this stuff up to date? Is all this stuff still relevant? Maybe we need to change a couple of the items that we've got in there, or to your point, maybe somebody that we were competing very heavily against, we just haven't really seen or been running into that much. So maybe we'll consider pushing them down into a different category, or along those lines. So,
interesting. So prioritization is both reactive to a moment that happens and proactive, because as a competitive intelligence guy, you've always got to stay up to date. So,
right.
Proactive, you're always making changes where necessary to individual battle cards, for example, competitive dossiers, whatever it happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, you may also reprioritize, but then reactive, hey, when something happens, we gotta stay on our toes. It's a little bit
definitely.
of both, and oftentimes the combination is what makes this more beneficial.
Exactly. Hit the nail on the head with that one.
What kind of stakeholders or stakeholder groups do you bring into those types of prioritization conversations? Like, do you stay in touch with your sales leadership? Do you stay in touch with a certain group of sellers that are sort of frontline? Is it your BD or your sort of a corporate development team? Because they're the ones that are actually going to be putting the pen to paper on an acquisition or a partnership. Like, who is that? Who is within that group where you're like, hey, we're going to have to shuffle things around, shuffle the deck, as you said, and put add a sixth tier 1 competitor that we got to pay attention to?
Mm-hmm.
Who is that? Who is in that tribe of people that you come after and you say, hey, is this the right call, or who you listen to when somebody tells you to do it or asks you to do it?
I'd say it's kind of a mix of all of the above.
Okay.
Sometimes it's coming from our product leadership group, our engineering head. Sometimes it's coming from sales. So as you said, there's various stakeholders that all have what's the word? I was going to say
game, right?
Yeah,
like
I was going to say
like
stakeholders that have a stake in it. It's like, well, yes, they're stakeholders. So there's various groups with which we're always in communication with, and so kind of that feedback and that input can come from any number of sources necessarily. Now we maintain kind of maybe a response team, if you will, that has like some key people from across all of those different groups within the corporate structure. So truly a cross-functional group, where we keep kind of that open communication. Hey, did you see this? Hey, did you see that? Hey, we should really start maybe paying attention to these people. So it's, very nebulous in the sense of it doesn't necessarily come from corporate strategy or, sales leadership. It could come from any of them. And so that's why, one of the things that we have always tried to maintain is making sure that we have those channels of communication with all of those different stakeholders. So it's not, so we've got as wide a net as possible for, where something new might come from, or, where a new competitor may emerge. So it's not any one particular group. It could, like I said, really come from any of the groups that we interface with.
It may not be one particular group, but I gotta believe, and based on my experience, the sales guys are always often the loudest in the room, because they're the ones who are feeling the pain if you're losing competitive opportunities, right? So are there stakeholders that you think perhaps carry a bit more weight because there's true bottom line revenue impact? Or are you in a place as a company from a corporate perspective where it's like, you know what, the product, like we have a vision, we're going to lose some deals from time to time, but we got to follow, product or corporate strategies lead here. And we, like, I guess, is there a louder voice in the room that you're forced to listen to just based on pressures internally or externally?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, as you said, sales obviously has the closest they have their feet in the fire, if you will, in
Yeah.
terms of always actively competing and having that direct um, conflict in terms of I'm up against these three vendors and
Yeah.
who's this
They're in the
guy,
arena. I mean,
yeah,
they're up against it every single day, right?
right. And I'm trying to think of when the last time that something like that would have come up. So usually, let's say if there was a new competitor that we hadn't really seen or heard a lot of, and sales was we really need this. We need to know what's going on with that. We would probably kind of take that back to that response team and just be like, hey, we're
Mm-hmm.
getting a lot of feedback, from the field that this vendor is really causing them trouble. And maybe oftentimes it tends to be very regionalized in the sense of it's this competitor but in this market,
Right. Right.
so it might not be a global type thing. It's like, okay, they're really challenged with this vendor, in whatever area it happens to
APAC or
be.
EMEA or
Sure.
whatever. Yeah. Yep.
Any of those, and so we'll look at, okay, well, is this just a local thing, or is this kind of a precursor for a larger play that we may see from them
Mm-hmm.
further on down the line? So, and it's not a big challenge to add somebody into the mix and maybe kind of put them down in that lower priority tier, just like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we'll keep an eye on them, but we'll do some research and enablement proactively just to kind of help them locally. But then we're also kind of setting the stage for, well, if we do need to spin it up, we're already engaged and starting to track and evaluating that vendor.
So it's not so much a no.
Right,
It's a yes but or a yes and, right? It's like,
right.
okay, that's a good data point, and I'm getting a
Mhm.
couple of these things from the London office or whatever, and like we'll put them into our tier 2. We'll put something together for the end of the quarter, and we'll reassess basically, as opposed to like, let's drop everything and let's freak out about it. There's a bit more of a gradual sort of, let's bring it back to the cross-functional team approach to this than drop everything, there's a fire, right?
Right. Now, of course, there could always be a drop everything, there's a fire
Oh, let's talk about that then. That's good to know.
trigger. There certainly could always be, where maybe it's, a critical deal, or I don't know. It just happens to have the right level of visibility where
Yeah.
uh,
We've all had that we've all
the
had that
directive has
happen,
come
right?
down, and
Yeah.
it's like, okay, thou shalt.
Somebody
Here are
with
the
chief in their
tablets,
title
and
is CC'd on the email, right? Everybody knows it,
right. And again, it still kind of factors back into the earlier thing. It's like, sure, there's a higher priority for that for this instance here, and then and even in the other case where we said, sure, we'll take a look at it, and but we'll put it down in this priority here, we're still responding to it at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and looking and saying, okay, they're having trouble. What can we do to help them out? If it's a deal in flight, then of course, we'll jump in and assist as best we can. It's kind of that ongoing. It's like, is this a one-time thing, or are we going to run into them all the time now? You know what I mean? So even in that case where it's come down from senior leadership, or the executive team saying, okay, get working on this, that's kind of the point in time where it's like, yes, we're engaged, we're involved. But then after the fact, kind of the post-mortem, looking back and saying, okay, is this, again, regardless of what source it came from, is this going to be an ongoing thing, in the
Yeah.
sense of this is truly a new competitor that we need to get all over and be ready for? Or is this still one that's like, okay, they're causing some trouble, they're making some noise, but that's still like one deal in 200 that we're seeing them. So
So
yeah,
it's another piece of criteria for prioritization, right? I mean,
yeah,
the decisions that you're making are still data backed at the end of the day. You mentioned one deal in 100. That means you went back to your CRM and said, okay, this is one noisy regional sales manager who lost a big deal, who got upset about it. And,
mhm,
when you actually look at the numbers, it's like, okay, it's a shame that you lost that deal, but we can't start a regular competitive maintenance project for this competitor because of that one. But yes, but we will, keep this in our back pocket and top of mind, but in our back pocket for a tier 2, regular engagements, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of it. Because in terms of, like I said, the who we're tracking already, it constitutes the majority of the competitive scenarios that we're running into. So any net new vendor that wasn't already on our radar is going to be kind of in that category where it's like there maybe it's a new startup, or maybe it's a spin-off of another company. So they probably don't have that market presence yet. They're not somebody that we're going to be running into in our daily life. But obviously, as you said, they've struck a nerve somewhere, and we need to be responsive and keep track of them, or depending on how big a nerve that's been struck, um, you know, shuffle them around in that tiering and say, okay, you know what, even though we're not running into them a lot now, they're doing some things that we need to just stay on top of, just to see, like they're, maybe they're still 1 in 100, but if they keep on that trajectory, maybe we're going to see them a lot more. So let's get ahead of it so that our people can, actively compete should they encounter them.
You are have the benefit of working for a pretty large enterprise that competes on a lot of fronts. I want you to put on your hypothetical hat for just a second, because there's entirely possible that some of our listeners or viewers don't have that type of stakeholder group. They don't have that type of potential market share, ideal customer profiles, total addressable market, etc. Let's say somebody comes to you and says, hey, Matt, we want to hire you to be our chief strategy officer. We're a smaller point solution that competes perhaps with a Commvault. You're perfect for this job. And you think to yourself, I got to spin up a competitive intelligence program. How do you, if you're a smaller point solution and you really only compete on one single front, how do you think about compartmentalizing? Is it a similar approach of tiering? How do we compete most frequently? Or is there this notion of aspirational? Hey, I'm going to put Commvault, who we don't compete with all the time, but gosh, we'd love to. We put them in a tier 2. Like, how would you approach this if you didn't work for a major player in the space? If you work for a smaller player, would you think about this differently or exactly the same? Sometimes you got to be punching up, and when you punch up, you got to act like the big boys. Like, how would you do that?
I don't think my strategy would be all that different, because even at on a smaller stage, like you said, you're still maybe competing with big enterprise players in that space. You might not be the enterprise yet, but maybe that's not even in your market. Maybe you're like, I'm going to get all the SMB business under this, so. But I think you'd still look at it the same in terms of, well, who are we currently competing against? Which is probably going to be others in similar situation, in the sense of like that, high velocity startup kind of business market. But then to your point, here's who we are competing against today, but here's who we want to compete against tomorrow.
Got it.
And kind of track them. Now, depending on how many people you're competing against, I look at some others which have very, very diverse portfolios. There'd be additional segmentation in terms of probably like, total lines of business, where it's like, okay, this is our hardware business, so we'll compete over here. This is our software business, and we'll compete over here. And this is our SaaS business. So, I'll give the typical SE answer with everything. It depends. So would I still be categorizing things in a similar fashion? I think so. Now, those categories would probably be very different.
Oh, sure.
But I think some of the same structure would persist in terms of, most frequently encountered. These are the ones that we absolutely need to be on top of, because they're the ones that our salespeople are competing every day against. And then, as you said, kind of those other categories in terms of, okay, well, we don't compete against these people all the time, but when we're in this scenario, then we always compete against them, kind of thing, so.
Sure. So when you are playing this hypothetical out in your brain, or when you're doing it in your daily life, categorization, prioritization, that leads to outcomes. That is to say that you're going to end up spending more time with your day-to-day competitive intelligence work on the tier 1, less time on the tier 2s, even further less time, fewer minutes, fewer hours on the tier 3s. What are some of the other key things that fall off as you go down a tier. So let's say you get the full a la carte menu with your
Right.
tier 1 competitors. What are some of the things you wouldn't focus on or wouldn't necessarily do every day, all the time for your tier 2s and tier 3s? And I ask this question because, again, I think in my brain of that, newer competitive intelligence professional, perhaps a smaller, more growth stage startup, they're trying to do this and they're like, okay, now I've figured out what my focus areas are. What do I not do to help keep my sanity? Right.
Right. So, like you said, you do have to focus the main lion's share of the effort against who are you competing against top
Yep.
tier. So that's where a lot of the, research, the creation of assets and like battle cards, other sales briefs. That's where a lot of your enablement efforts are probably going to be in too, in terms of not just creating content, but training, getting that information out there. Working with the enablement teams, the channel teams, all that, to make sure that the people in the field that are competing on a daily basis, A, know where that information is, and B, can utilize it. So that's kind of the top priority there. So kind of as you go down some of the things, I mean, obviously you're not going to be having to spend as much time training people about some of these tier 3 or tertiary players down there, because you know like you said, you might not run into them, and except for maybe once every year, if that. We've got a number of competitors that that, and that changes too. I can look back and see, hey, these are competitors that we actively were keeping and maintaining a lot of content around, and now we barely do anything with it, just because they've just either they've shifted market, or exited completely from being an active competitor. So I mean, those things are going to change over time as vendors move around. But really, like you said, it's just the general level of effort. Is like, do I need to create battle cards specific for these vendors? Do I need to create like a competitive brief on all of these vendors? Probably not. Do I need to do active enablement with the field, to make sure that they're up to speed with the latest and greatest on what's happening with these vendors on the back burner? Probably not, because that's not going to be where they are most interested in learning about. Tell me about what our top competitors are doing. Tell me about how do I compete against them? How do I beat them in this scenario? How do I, counter these obstacles?
So I feel like what you've just stated, or what you've just said, is that, and this is where I was going to go with this next, is that there is already amongst your various stakeholders a general acceptance or understanding of what the tiers are. You didn't necessarily have to publish this anyplace. You didn't necessarily have to tell everybody like, oh, they're a tier 1, that's a tier 2. Everyone has been on the same page from the jump, so it's not like you have to establish SLAs and say, this is what we're going to do for these guys, not do for these guys. Everyone just already knows it because everyone's feeling the same pain, and everyone's already come to this level of consensus that was required when you were prioritizing in the first place, right?
I think that's a fair statement, and kind of where you're probably going with this is not everybody has that luxury of establish, like let's look at another industry where there's probably an established hierarchy in terms of competitors. So look at like the consumer pickup truck market.
Okay.
If you're working at Ford, your top competitors are going to be Chevy, Dodge, Toyota, and then well, then we'll put Honda in there, and then it's like, okay, well, Tesla's making trucks, but are they really making trucks?
Are they really a competitor? Yeah, exactly.
For our consumers, are they going to buy that vehicle? So certain markets obviously have that kind of predefined, okay, these are the players that we know we're going to be competing against, but not everybody's going to have that luxury, and some of that is going to have to get sorted out over time, with a little bit more communication and give and take in terms of working with the field, in terms of, okay, who are you competing with, who are you competing with, who are you winning against, who are you losing against, and linking that all through the CRM numbers, and looking at, okay, you think you're competing against them, but really you only ran into them twice. But maybe they're just the most annoying out of them to deal with, but but yeah, so if you don't already have that kind of uh, understanding in terms of like, well, here are the players, and everybody kind of agrees, yeah, then you need to get a little bit more involved with your stakeholders to see who's important, because if you are talking with these different groups, again, when we're looking at the categorization, some vendors might be more important to other groups. Maybe it's okay, well, sales, these are the people we're competing against, but maybe on the product marketing side, they're saying, okay, well, we like what they're doing in
Yeah.
terms of messaging, and we really want to prioritize them. So if they're doing something, we want to know what's happening there. So there could even be a different prioritization amongst the different stakeholders, depending on where your business is at in terms of its development and maturity and just roadmap. Um, but in this case, I'm lucky that there's kind of a consensus around who are we competing with. Um, but if you don't have that, then you need to engage with your stakeholders and figure out what that should be, and go back and check on them. It's like, hey, are these still who you guys evaluate as your top competitors? So, because like we said before, those can change in the ebb and flow of time.
It seems to me that Matt has a pretty well-defined process to compartmentalize the brands that he's competing with, and was able to get a cross-functional team together to agree on the right groups or tiers of competitors to pay more attention to, and which ones that need just a little bit of more of a cursory glance. But that's an interdepartmental group of middle managers and C-suiters. What happens when the head honcho comes knocking on your door? Had Matt ever dealt with a request from the CEO or the chairperson of the board who wanted him to take a look at someone new, perhaps outside of the tiering that had been agreed upon by the so-called Council of Elders?
Not so much. Usually it's when one of those types of requests come down, it tends to be a little bit more focused in the sense of, okay, what's going on with this space here?
Yep.
I want to know, who's competing with us here, how are they competing, and why. So it tends to be a little bit more focused maybe on a market segment or a use case, and less so on a competitor, unless unless it happens to be, it's like, maybe a big event. It's like, I need to know exactly what just happened with this. But usually at that point, we've been engaged, we're already on top of that. So it tends to be a little bit more use case specific around, hey, we're thinking about going this way, or and so we want to know who does what in that space.
But also,
so the requests kind of take precedent, but they're not necessarily, or thus far, they haven't necessarily been out of sync with kind of established priorities.
Well, that's because you've run this prioritization all the way up the flagpole anyways, and if everybody is sort of singing from the same hymnal, then that they wouldn't have come to you with a competitor you've never heard of before, because everyone had already agreed that this is the prioritization. And that's the benefit of doing this cross-functionally, because when the CEO comes to you about something, they're not going to be all the way out of left field, because the CRO has already sort of approved what the prioritization is. The CPO has approved the prioritization. If they're all working for the CEO, then it can't be all that different from what you were working on before.
Yeah, I guess it would be a bad thing if you were surprised by a competitor that one of them came and asked with.
Career warning light blinking in your eye,
right?
That's great.
But you never know. I mean, you always have to be aware of the fact that people have different routes for information. And especially when you get up into the executive level, they have a lot of relationships amongst peers in the industry. They actually probably know the president from competitor X, and sit down and have coffee or a drink or something like that every so often, and they hear things through the grapevine too. So while I jokingly said, hopefully you're not going to be surprised by something, you just don't know, because they might have channels and some backroom information that maybe you don't have access to, and they could surprise you and be like, hey, we heard that they're going to be doing this. Can you look into it? And be like, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting that, but yeah, well, let's dive into it. So, joking aside, you just really never know where some of these triggers, as I call them, can come from.
That's it. That's the ball game. Here's the buzzer. Our time together is up. It was great to catch up with Matt Tyrer from Commvault, and the big thing that I took away from our conversation was that keeping track of entirely too many competitors or saying yes to a research project for any new logo under the sun could be a recipe for distraction. I think Matt had some great ideas on how you can start putting the logos that are, well, keeping you up at night into tiers so you can wake up in the morning feeling refreshed and focused on the most important competitive intelligence tasks at hand. So if you've got a topic around competitive intelligence that you'd like to chat with me about on a future episode of the podcast, well, why not reach out? Send me an email at eric@crayon.co or find me in the Product Marketing Alliance's Slack team. Look for me in the Competitive Intel channel. You've just listened to the PMA's podcast, Into the Fray, presented by Crayon. Thanks once again to Matt Tyrer from Commvault for being our guest on the show. And by the way, if you enjoy what you just heard, we'd be grateful if you could hit the subscribe button either on Apple, Spotify, or Crayon, or the PMA's YouTube channels, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really, really like listening to Matt and I talk about segmentation, let us know by giving us a 5-star review. I'm Erik Mansur, and until next time, whoever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you get out there and compete like you mean it.